10 translators, an author, and an editor stood on a stage.
So if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll come to you. So one from Iris.
I have a question which does not have so much to do with translation, but Elena Ferrante is not known in Germany at all, I think. So I would wonder if Joshua could explain why he wrote an article on Ferrante and Knausgård, as we say in German. So what was the? But here, every bookstore is packed with her books.
So the question is, why those two? Oh, there's no real relationship. There was just a period. I think it was last year, or maybe it was like a little bit more than a year ago, when it seemed like everyone I knew who was a serious reader were reading at the same time the My Struggle novels and the Neapolitan novels at the same time, and it was really common to. This sounds precious, but it was true, that it was common to get into like debates with people over who was better, and everyone seemed to have sort of preferences that had to do with, I mean, some of it was gender, but not as much as you would imagine. So I think I was just interested in why and what. When people that I knew articulated a preference for one of them over the other, which you just do, it's one of those random things that happens in your life as a reader, that it's like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. There's really no reason why you have to choose, but because you read them at the same time, you do sort of end up choosing. And that I thought was fascinating. And it's one of these things too, where novels in translation do create another, there are windows into sensibilities or into circumstances that are pretty different from the ones that you inhabit in your day-to-day life. So there is a natural pleasure that you can derive from just contemplating, like, would I be happier somehow, or am I more represented by this other person who's from another culture and is in another language? Are they somehow more like me than the people I encounter in the novels I read in my own culture? There's interesting questions around that. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, thank you.
As Daniel just described that he had an intimate relationship with his translator, I wanted to ask the other translators how common it is in their practice to have a dialogue with the authors, and how much they enter into heavy discussions where an author might insist on something and the translator has to explain that the culture that he's translating it for, that it will not read the same way as in his own language.
Luckily, Alvaro is not the kind of author who insists on his version. I've done both kinds of translations. I worked for 10 years on the books of Roberto Bolaño, who died before I began translating him. So, there's a certain freedom that comes with not collaborating with the author. But but if you have to work with the author, then Alvaro is kind of the perfect writer to work with. His English is wonderful, and he's very funny, and he understands. And he, as he said on stage, he thinks of the translation or of the novel as a living work that changes in translation. And I think better than anyone else I've worked with, he really gets what's happening in the process of translation. I have worked with a couple of other living authors, and I've always had really interesting, and I've learned a lot from working with writers.
I've had nothing but really great experiences working with living authors, and working with, I've done probably an equal number of authors who aren't alive and authors who are alive. And when I've been working on Kafka's Diaries for as long as I can remember now. And
I would imagine that Kafka is very, very difficult to deal with.
Yeah, well, I would like to be able to sit down with him for, 9 to 12 years and try to figure out some of this stuff and work through it, but I can't. But with living authors, I've had the experience that an author is never usually shy about talking about their own work. You can usually engage them about their own work almost inexhaustibly, which for me is, I can only benefit from that. And that works as a joke because everyone thinks of the vanity of the author, but actually I think that what I've discovered a lot is that one of the reasons the conversation is so inexhaustible is because authors haven't thought about all this stuff about their work the way you are as a translator. So they discover that you're looking for all these intentions in their work. You're trying to get at something very intentional and conscious, and they've produced their work very much by instinct, and of course there's some level of intellectual intention, but there's a lot that's happening that's just part of the creative process that's more or less spontaneous, or just they haven't interrogated it very deeply. So when they're given the opportunity to start to kind of explore the almost unconscious of their work, it develops into a conversation that's I think very rich for everyone involved, and for the translator, everything you get is grist for the mill. It's sort of like being a therapist, where if they start talking about their favorite music or something that seems totally unrelated to the work, suddenly you can get a sense of who this person is, and maybe, oh wait, that kind of relates to this aspect of the work and gives me an idea about another way into it. So I've found it, and I have never had the experience that an author didn't get that the translation is my work and not theirs. Like everyone asks, well, do you feel like they're breathing down your neck? Because people know English and they want, but I've never, maybe it's just luck, but the authors that I've worked with have never seemed to feel such ownership of their text that they would want to get in my way. They've really been only just wanted to be helpful. So good experiences.
Do translators sometimes visit the place, let's say like Naples? Mrs. Goldstein, did she visit Naples to get a feel for that particular area in Naples? Because I remember when Günter Grass once took all his 22 translators to Danzig, that they get a feel for Danzig. And I just wonder if some of the translators visited certain regions where the book took place.
I had been to Naples years ago before I started translating the book, so I had a little bit of an idea. But I didn't actually go during the time I was working on them, so maybe I would have been better off to do that, because it's helpful even if you don't actually use the actual descriptions or places to have a sense of it, obviously, as you say.
Well, I didn't visit 16th century Rome or Mexico. I'm sure it would have been very edifying if I had. But I did spend 2 months in Mexico City when I was translating The Savage Detectives, and that was very, very helpful. And I learned Spanish in Spain, and I have, the deepest connection to Spain, but I feel like Mexico is also a place that I'm very interested in, and I've done, a bunch of translations of Mexican writers or writers who spent time in Mexico. So hopefully I'll spend more time.
This question's for the translators, any of them or all of them. We've had a few examples today, but if you have any more examples in your whole translating career of incredibly creative workarounds for untranslatable moments that just stand out to you as the things you're really proud of, and don't worry about being boastful. I mean, it's very, illuminating to hear how you might encounter something that has no one-to-one correspondence, whether it's, lack of a gender equivalence, the absence of a gender equivalence in a pronoun usage or something in English, or a verb tense that has a nuance that is just not replicable, but something that you ponder for hours or even days, and then some backdoor solution just sneaks in and you're like, aha, that's it. Is there anything that stands out to you?
I'm teaching a translation workshop, and I just assigned to them a passage to translate from one of Alvaro's other novels, Vidas Perpendiculares, and the expression cuernos de miura came up. And ponerse cuernos in Spanish means to be cuckolded in English. And de miura, I'm pretty sure, is Alvaro's edition, his own personal edition. But de miura turns out to be a particular ranch where the best bulls are raised. So in other words, to be cuckolded de miura means to be cuckolded to the max. So I can't say that I didn't work on this I didn't spend a long time working on this because it was for a course, and I just was curious to see what my students would come up with. But I think my I'm a little embarrassed to say this because I don't think this is the best solution, but I had come up with major league dalliance for. So there's just a little thing.
There's in Kehlmann's, that's his Indigo. There's it's just wordplay, and this is us. It's also, I don't feel like it's so boastful because it's also luck if you can get one, or sometimes there is no option or you just don't find one. But here there was a good option. So it's people are supposedly, a guy is talking, he's kind of bullshitting in a dialogue, and he's telling this anecdote that's totally preposterous about people online, or inline, I guess we only say online in New York. That's something I discovered in translating this passage. People in line for a baby hatch in Brooklyn. He's telling the story in Belgium. And he's like, in Brooklyn, what? Because this is a real thing, baby hatches, in some... Anyway, we won't get into that. This is an internet rabbit hole for people to go down. But they call it a baby klappa in the German version. And the line for the baby klappa, at some point, this guy who's kind of bullshitting makes this joke, and he calls a line as a Schlange, which is the same word for snake. So he calls the line for the baby hatch a Klapperschlange, which is a rattlesnake. And haha, Klapperschlange. I just made a stupid pun.
Yeah.
And the whole story is about that there's this woman on the line for the baby hatch, and everyone notices that she doesn't have a baby. It's a place to give up your baby, right? This childless woman, and they're asking her why she's there, and she won't answer, and they're trying to imagine what she's going to put, and she gets to the baby hatch, and then that's where then it's a shaggy dog story, actually. So it just ends. You don't find out what she's going to put in. But it's she says Klapperschlange. So I had her it's a baby hatch, so I said, on the hatch line without a hatchling. That was
Oh, wonderful.
But if the word hatchling hadn't existed, I had to use hatch, so I would have had no solution. So it's really luck that we just happen to have a word that has hatch and has something to do with children.
Yeah.
Anyway.
That's awesome. Well, with that, I think we're going to wrap things up. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to the participants. And I would like to encourage you to buy books on that table over there, and also to come to the next event in the festival tonight, which is at Book Court. It's at 6 p.m., and it's called No Joke, and it's moderated by Siri Hustvedt, and it's featuring James Hanahan. Thanks again.
I'm